Hello everyone and welcome to my video. Today I would like to show you how you can set up LinkedIn as a social identity provider in Cognito using Auth0. How you can create and configure all of the resources in AWS, so the user pool and identity pool in Cognito. Then I will show you how to create and configure a LinkedIn application, an Auth0 application, and build a simple Node.js backend with a very simplistic front end. And in the end, I will introduce a simple CloudFormation template to automate resource creation for AWS. Let's start with some theory. If you would go to Cognito and check what kind of integrations are available there, then you would see that you can integrate with various social identity providers like Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, or Twitter, and also with SAML, so Security Assertion Markup Language, and OpenID Connect. And as you can see, LinkedIn is not mentioned here, and it actually doesn't fall into any of the categories. So it's neither SAML nor OpenID Connect. LinkedIn by itself supports only OAuth, and Cognito cannot directly integrate with it. So the only thing that Cognito can do is to use something that is called OpenID Connect, which is a standard built on top of OAuth. So to be able to use it, we actually need to somehow hide LinkedIn behind an OpenID Connect interface. So whatever provider or whatever system we could use to hide LinkedIn and to expose an OpenID Connect interface to us could be used in this case. And what I'm going to propose here is to use a free tool called Auth0, which can easily integrate with LinkedIn and exposes an OpenID Connect interface, which Cognito can connect to. An important thing to mention is that the whole integration will be based on an authorization grant token. This means that we will have here a custom built backend that will be steering and controlling the whole flow. There are, of course, other ways of implementing it, for example, directly in the browser. I just chose here to do it with this type of integration. So everything that you will see later will be based on it and nothing else will be discussed. So let's start at the beginning. You start the entire flow by going to a login page, which is served by your backend. This backend will do nothing else but redirect you to Cognito, to a hosted UI, which will, in response, give you a provider selection page. On this provider selection page, you have to select Auth0, which will then bring you to another provider selection page, this time in Auth0. And there you will choose LinkedIn. You will then be redirected to LinkedIn login page. You have to provide your credentials and will again be redirected to a page where LinkedIn will ask you to allow an application, a special application that you will create to read your profile information. So your first and last name, your email address, and also your photo. When you allow this, you will be redirected back to Auth0. Now you will be redirected with a special authorization code that got generated by LinkedIn. And with this authorization code, Auth0 will be able to exchange it for a special access token. And with this access token, it can later read your user details and store it internally in its own user database. After this happens, now Auth0 will redirect you with yet another authorization code, this time authorization code from Auth0 to Cognito. This now Cognito will take this authorization code and will exchange it with Auth0 for a set of JSON web tokens. So this is where OpenID Connect triggers. Auth0 will give you the tokens, and then Cognito is able to read your user data from Auth0 and store it in its own user database. After this happens, Cognito then again makes another redirect with an authorization code from itself to your custom backend. Your custom backend takes this authorization code, goes to Cognito, and exchanges this for a set of JSON web tokens. So again, this is OpenID Connect protocol. Now your backend will return those tokens back to your browser. Your browser will create a new identity with one of those tokens, with an ID token, which represents your identity, your user details. We'll get this ID back, and with this identity and the ID token, it will be able to receive a set of access key ID and secret key from Cognito. And with those credentials, you now are able to make requests directly to AWS resources. Now that you know how this whole implementation is going to work, let's go to the browser and create all of the necessary resources. We will start by the end of it. So basically by creating a LinkedIn application. You go to linkedin.com/developers. The link is in video description, and create your application. Now you have to provide a name, any name actually. Test app, for example. Now the LinkedIn page, it is mandatory, so you have to select it, although it doesn't really matter what you're going to choose here, because you have to, if you want to really use it, you have to, like in the production environment, you have to verify your selection. And we are not really going to do this. We are not going to trigger this verification. So whatever we're going to choose here doesn't really matter. Now you have to specify the application logo, and just remember this has to be a square image. So LinkedIn is not going to crop anything here. It already has to be provided as a square image. Now agree to the terms and create the application. Now we need to allow this application to work with sign-in, and this is done by going to products and choosing sign in with LinkedIn. Now it says here review in progress. This can take a few seconds, maybe a little bit longer, but this is an automated process, so you don't really have to do anything here. It will get approved after a while, but in the meantime, we can already go to Auth0, but don't close the tab yet because we will have to come back here. We can go to Auth0 and create an application, another application there. Since I already have an account, I will just log in directly. Okay, and in the left navigation, we go to applications and create the application. Name doesn't really matter. Because we are going to use the authorization code grant, Auth0 suggests to use, in this case, a regular web application. So the difference here between those various applications is in the details which authorization grant flow you want to use. In our case, the most suitable one is this, although other might work as well. So let's just choose the regular web application and create it. All right, now that we have our application created, we can go back to the LinkedIn application and finish the configuration here. Go to the Auth tab, and here under OAuth 2 settings, we have to configure the authorized redirect URLs for your app. And this URL will look as follows. So it's HTTPS, and now the domain. The domain you can find on your Auth0 application. Go to settings, and this is the domain that you want. And now the rest of the URL like this. Now, this is the callback that will be triggered after you successfully signed in with LinkedIn. So you will provide your credentials, then you will say that you allow this application to read your data. And the moment you click it, LinkedIn will simply redirect you with the authorization code to Auth0. And this is the endpoint where the request will go. Okay, so now that we have the LinkedIn application fully configured, we can go back to Auth0 and we can configure the integration with LinkedIn. In the left navigation, you will see connections and social. Now create connection and choose LinkedIn. Here you specify the API key and the secret key. These are the credentials from your LinkedIn application. If we go back to the application, to the Auth tab, here you have the client ID, which is the API key, and the client secret, which is the secret key. Now from our LinkedIn, we want to be able to read the profile. So the first name, last name, and then the image. This is already the basics, which is always required. But we also want to have access to the email. We will, in the end, show it on the page. Just select it and click Create. Now we have to enable this integration, this connection for our application that we already created. That's my app. And we can actually try this connection. So we can click on Try Connection. We will sign in. Okay, even though my settings are, my LinkedIn is in English, my browser is in English, the entire OS is in English, and yet LinkedIn decided to show the page in German, but this is basically the page where LinkedIn asks you to give permissions to the application that you previously created so that the application can read your primary email address or also your name and your image. So we click on Allow, and we now got redirected back to Auth0. And it says everything works fine. And here are the details, our user details that we got from LinkedIn. Now you can easily check this. We can close this page and we can go to users and roles. And under users, you will see now a user we just got created a few seconds ago. I can just delete it for now. Don't really want it. And we can also remove the integration. So from your LinkedIn account, go to Settings and Privacy. Yeah, of course, and suddenly everything is in German, because why not? Change it quickly to English. Go to Data Privacy and to Other Applications and Permitted Services. And here under Permitted Services, you will see the application you allowed to read your data before, and just simply remove it. Now we are ready to go back to AWS and configure the resources here. So let's go to Cognito and create our user pool first. So here you just click on Create User Pool. We have to specify a name. Test user pool, click on review defaults and choose custom attributes. So here we will say which attributes we actually want to have. So which attributes will be stored together with our user data. So that's going to be email. We also want the family name and a given name. Let's just click through all the steps and leave everything as default. Don't really need anything special here. All right. Okay, so we have the application created. Now the next thing we will do is to create a hosted UI. And for the hosted UI, we actually need a domain. So let's check if this is available. Yes, so this domain is available. We can now click Save Changes. And when we have this domain, the next step is to create a new application. So we create an application, test app, doesn't really matter. Now generate client secret. We don't really need this one. I mean, we could of course generate it and we could use it, but from the security perspective, it's not going to really matter because in the end, if you remember, we are going to pass the obtained tokens, JSON web tokens, back to our browser. So the fact that we have a client secret really doesn't give us anything because the tokens are still exposed to the browser. And if someone can control your browser, then obviously they can control your tokens, and that means they can do with them whatever they want. So it's not really an issue if we don't generate the client secret, so we don't really have to do this. All the Auth0 configurations, we can leave it as default or deselect everything because we are not going to use any of that in this tutorial because our only user will be a federated user from Auth0. So, and this is internal for Cognito. All we have to do is to select attributes that the application will be able to read and write. And if you remember, we specified before email, family name, and a given name as attributes. And these are exactly the attributes the application can write, but we also want to be able to read them. Now we can create the application client. Now that we have this, we can finish configuration of our Auth0 application. Let's go back to our application, under Applications, Settings. What we still have to configure here are the two callbacks. So the callback URL and the logout URL. Now let's start with the callback URL. So this is pretty much the domain. This is the hosted domain. From Cognito. We have to copy over. And at the end, just add the auth2/IDP response. Now the allowed logout URL. So this is the final URL where Auth0 will redirect you when you log out. And this is your custom backend endpoint. Therefore, localhost at port 8080, because the application now will show you in a few moments will run under localhost and this port. Now we just have to save the changes and go back to Cognito. Now, here we have to start configuring the integration with Auth0. So under the federation and identity providers, go to OpenID Connect, set the provider name like Auth0. Here we have to provide a client ID and client secret, and those are client ID and secrets from your Auth0 application. If we scroll back to the top, and here we have the client ID, can copy it over, and here we have the client secret. Leave the attributes request method as get, and we have to provide the authorized scope. So basically the authorized scope is what we want to be able to do. We want to be, first and foremost, we want to be able to use the OpenID Connect interface. So we need OpenID. We also want to be able to use user details like email and profile, right? This is something that we want to read from Auth0 and store it in Cognito. So we have to ask for those specific scopes. Now the issuer part is where Cognito will figure out all the OpenID Connect endpoints. You don't have to specify them yourself. You just need to specify the issuer. And to do this, we go back to our Auth0 application, and here just copy the domain. Paste in the domain and run discovery. You should see successfully fetch the OpenID configuration endpoint. And now create the provider. And here at the bottom, we have the provider Auth0. Now we have the integration almost ready. We have the provider itself, but now we said that we want to be able to read some data from Auth0. And to do this, under attribute mapping, under federation attribute mapping, we have to specify how the attributes from Auth0 mapped into attributes that we will store in Cognito. And this one is already here by default. So this is OIDC, this is Auth0. And we also said we want to have the family name. Family name. We also want given name. And we also want an email address. You can save it. And now these attributes will be mapped from Auth0 to Cognito. We are almost ready here. All we have to do now is to configure the client application. First and foremost, we want to enable identity providers, our identity provider. So Auth0, this is the identity provider that we created here in the federation. We have to specify a callback URL and a signout URL. Now the callback URL is where Cognito will redirect you with its authorization code. And this is going to be your backend. And so we can just put here the local host, so that your local application. And now the signout URL is a little bit more tricky. I'm going to paste here something and let's explain what this really is. So first of all, this is the signout URL for Auth0. So this is the domain from Auth0, right? If you go to your Auth0 application under the domain, this is the domain. The client ID again, this is the client ID from Auth0. Let's start by explaining why this is actually pointing to Auth0 here. When you will log out, you will hit an endpoint in Cognito. Cognito will simply remove a cookie from your hosted UI and will redirect you to exactly this URL, to Auth0. This will simply remove cookie from Auth0 and in the end, redirect you back to your local application. Now, you may have wondered what happened actually to LinkedIn in this whole process. So we logged out of Cognito, we logged out of Auth0, and then we are logging out of our own application. But where is LinkedIn? Well, unfortunately, we cannot automatically log out of LinkedIn here, because for that, LinkedIn would have to support something that is called a federated signout. And the federated signout would simply allow Auth0 to sign you out directly from within Auth0 on your behalf. And this is unfortunately not supported by LinkedIn at this time. So all we can do is to sign out of Cognito, then Auth0, and then in the end, ask Auth0 to redirect to our local host. So this is exactly what this signout URL is for. All right, we have this one. So now we have to allow the outflows. As we said, we are going to work with authorization code grant only. So we only select this one. And now we have to allow our auth scopes. Now, first scope we have to allow is definitely an OpenID, because we are going to use the OpenID protocol. We also want to be able to read user email and profile, and to actually be physically able to read them, because this just tells you, okay, you have access to it, but it's the question how you read them. And to be able to read them, you have to select this scope. This will actually allow us to read the data. Now we can save it. And we are pretty much done configuring the user pool. Now we can go to identity pool. So let's go to Cognito, manage identity pools. I can create a test ID IDP. We don't want to have unauthenticated identity, so we don't select here anything. And under authentication providers, we have to specify Cognito here. So our users are not, it might be a little bit misleading, because you can see here OpenID, you would have assumed that this is what we are talking about here. No, our identity or our user at this point is already in Cognito. So we went through the whole authentication flow and authorization flow, and the user is already in Cognito. And to create a new identity in identity pool for that user, we will refer to a user who is already in Cognito. And therefore we specify here a user pool ID and app client ID of our user pool. Let's quickly go to our user pool. That's the pool ID. And the application client, that's the one we want here. And now we can create, the pool. All right. And in this step, you have to create the AIM roles to actually, to later allow your authenticated user to do something, to access resources in AWS. Now here under details, you have two different roles. One is for an authenticated user, one is for unauthenticated user. I mean, yes, we did not check the unauthenticated user in the previous step, and yet you still have to create this role. This is just something that Cognito requires you to do, even though technically this is not really necessary, and you will see it at the end when we will create all the resources through CloudFormation template. We won't be creating the unauthenticated role, and it will still work just fine. And we want to edit this policy because we want to add additional permission to this role so that this role can use the poly service to synthesize speech. So we have to add here something like this one, like poly synthesize speech. And this will be later used on the website to actually convert text to speech. We'll get that later. Click on the allow, and here we go. We have our identity pool created. Now that we have our user pool and identity pool created, we can go to our backend application. I am going to do everything in Visual Studio Code. The application is available on GitHub, and you can find the link to the repository in the description of this video. This is a Node.js application. It requires Node 12, and it's not necessary, but you may want to also install NodeMon to automatically restart the application. I already have everything configured here. The repository itself also contains container configuration for Visual Studio Code. So if you are using Visual Studio Code, you don't have to do anything. You can just reopen the whole project inside the container, and this container have everything installed and configured properly. So the thing we have to do is to install our dependencies. Now we have the dependencies installed. We need to configure the application. So let's just copy over the .env file. And let's edit it. So the first thing we have to put here is region. So you will put your region there. So where you created your identity pool and user pool. For me, it was Ireland. So that's EU West 1. Now the user pool host. This is something we can create in our user pool. Domain name. This is exactly it. All right. Now the application client ID. Again, we can go back to the browser. And under app clients, we can copy the ID. Now the sign out URL, we can also copy from the browser. We can go to app client settings and we can copy the sign out URL. Now you may wonder why we are actually copying this over if we already have it specified here. Now this is specified here just as a verification, because theoretically you can have multiple different URLs provided here and you have to tell which one you actually want to use. And this is like a verification, so you cannot provide anything that isn't on this list. So let's just copy it. And paste it here. Now we have the user pool ID. So again, we will go back to the browser. And under general settings, we have the user pool ID. Paste it here. Now the identity pool name. Same thing, we go to the browser. And either identity pool in the top right corner, you have edit identity pool. And here is the name of the identity pool. You can paste it here and also the ID of it. That's the ID. All right, so now we are ready to roll. Let's just start the application and go to the browser. And open the local host. Now, this is the version of the page where you're still authenticated. And if you remember before, I showed you that the first thing is we go to your backend, and this backend will, upon clicking on this login, will go to the backend, and this backend will then redirect you to Cognito, to provider selection page. If we go back to the code, to the application code, to app.js file, this is pretty much this endpoint. So this is the login endpoint, and this will redirect you to Cognito with some specific parameters. So the response type, this specifies the authorization code flow, hence the name code here, the value code. The client ID, so the ID of the Cognito application, the redirect URL, the state. The state is something that we generate here locally. And the state will be later sent to us together with a callback. And our application has to confirm if this value is exactly the same. This is just here so that no one can impersonate your backend. So whoever would try to do this would have to know this value. And then the scopes that we want to require from Cognito, which is exactly the things that we specified in the browser. So OpenID, email, profile, and this long part here, which is just for us to be able to later actually read the profile and email. And this will redirect us to Cognito. And from now on, we are outside of the application. So the rest of the flow will happen outside of the application. Only at the very end, we will hit this endpoint, so the callback. But let's go to the browser and see exactly what is going to happen. So if we click here on login with LinkedIn, we'll be redirected to Auth0 provider selection page. This is our identity provider that we created. That's its name, Auth0. When we click on it, we go to Auth0. Now we are on Auth0, and here we have another identity provider selection. This time this is LinkedIn. This will now ask us to sign in, and again, show us, ask us to give permissions. Again, who knows why it's in German? Probably because that's what LinkedIn thinks is best. Click on allow. And now the whole set of redirect happens. So first the redirect to Auth0, then Auth0 redirected to Cognito, and Cognito redirected us to our backend application. We can easily prove this if we go now to Auth0 under the users. We again have our user, right? And settings of the LinkedIn application. Again, yes. German, because why not? And data privacy, permitted services. We again have our application. And if we go to the user pool and to user and groups, refresh this one, you can see we already have here a user. And in identity pool, we also have our first identity created. The identity is our browser. So the last redirect that happened from Cognito went to our backend and went to this endpoint, this auth callback. Here we check for errors. Here we check for the state. So this is the state that we used here when we first logged in. We just compare if this is the same value. And then we grab the code, the authorization code. And with this code, we make a request to Cognito to exchange this authorization code for a set of tokens, JSON Web Tokens. So these are the JSON Web Tokens returned by Cognito. We store them in a session and then redirect to the homepage. Now we have those tokens in the browser. And the first thing we are doing is we actually read from Cognito these data. So the name and the email address. Let's quickly look into the code where it happens and how it exactly happens. So in code, in index file, let's just scroll to the top. Now, this is the first call that we make to read users' data. So the given name, family name, and email name. There is an endpoint in Cognito that allows you to do this, the get user endpoint, and this endpoint only requires access token. So the tokens that you received from Cognito also contain this access token, and you don't really need, at this point in time, you don't really need any identity created. You simply need this access token to be able to read your own data. And this is what is happening here. So we read our own data. Second thing is, here we create the actual identity with an ID token. This ID token is used exactly here in this place. So we don't have an identity yet. In identity, we mean here a browser. So basically, our browser is the identity, and we want to create this for the user, which is specified in this ID token. Now, this part here is an important part. So we are saying, okay, this is the ID token, and please verify this ID token within this user pool, because this ID token belongs to this user pool. It was generated for this user pool, and this is where Cognito has to look for it. When this returns, we have the new identity ID, and with this new identity ID, we can now again call Cognito to give us the access key and the secret access key. And again, we say, okay, Cognito, please verify the ID token within this user pool, within the user pool that we created, and this ID token comes from this user pool, so it has to be verified against it. If everything, oh, sorry, no, this is just a constructor. So here nothing really happens. The actual request is made here in the refresh method. Now, yes, it's called refresh, even though we are generating a completely new credentials, but basically everything is, put it this way, hidden from us. So we only have to do this once, and then the SDK will make sure that this is refreshed. And then we'll again in the background use the refresh to refresh the credentials, so we don't have to worry about it. And the credentials will be stored in the SDK so that later we can use this speak text function to actually call the poly service to transform text into speech. Now, if we go back to the browser, and here we are, we can click on the synthesize, which will call polyservice. And the polyservice will return as an MP3, which we can play here.
You successfully authenticated with LinkedIn using Auth0 and AWS Cognito.
And that's pretty much it. As you can see, everything works as expected. Now the last thing we can do here is to log out. And again, this will trigger a series of redirects. So it will redirect you first. It will first go to Cognito, where it will remove your cookies. Then it will redirect you to Auth0, where it will remove your cookies. Auth0 will redirect to your backend, where we will remove the local session. And now we are logged out of Cognito and Auth0. Of course, the users, they are still here if we refresh this. So the users still exist, obviously. It's just painfully slow. Yes, I know. And here, if we refresh, obviously the user exists, but it's no longer authenticated. Now we can go through this whole process again. And since we are not already, but still logged into LinkedIn, after choosing all the providers, we will actually go straight to our website. We won't have to go to LinkedIn anymore because, well, we are still logged in. We obtain now a new set of credentials, and we can do...
You successfully authenticated with LinkedIn using Auth0 and AWS Cognito.
Synthesize our text. As a bonus, I want to show you how you can simplify the resource creation in Cognito. And for that, we are going to use CloudFormation. And this is relatively simple and straightforward. So we will be creating a user pool with specific attributes that are required. So email verified, family name, and a given name. Now the email verified wasn't mentioned when we were creating the resource directly in the console, simply because it's actually impossible to specify it there. You can't just do it, but you can do it in CloudFormation, for example. Then we create our domain. Then we have to create our identity provider in the user pool. This is an OIDC provider, and we specify the client ID, secret, the request attributes request method, the issuer, and the authorization scopes that we want. These are exactly the same scopes that we had that we specified in the console. And here are the attribute mappings, so the mappings between Auth0 and Cognito. On the left, you have Cognito attribute names, and on the right are Auth0 names. At least those are pretty much the same names, so that might be a little bit confusing. But this one is the important one. The difference is here. The sub comes from OIDC, and the username is just an attribute name in Cognito. Now we have to create the user pool. So the allowed authorization flow is code. Then the scopes that we wanted to have, that's OpenID, email, profile, and the scope that is actually needed to read the email and profile. The callback URLs, the client name that we don't want to generate secrets, the identity provider that is connected to this client. We will see later how this is actually created, and the read and write attributes that this client can work with. Here we create the identity pool. This is really simple. We don't want to, the only thing that we are pretty much specifying that is different than default is just that we don't want to unauthenticated identities, and we correlate the client ID and the provider name. And the last thing that we have to do here is to specify the actual role, the role that will be assumed by a logged in user. Now, this is a little bit more complex. There is a lot of stuff happening here. So let's start with assume role policy document. So this whole part tells us who will be able to assume this role. So first of all, we specify the principal, and the principal is federated. Federated means this is not a user that belongs to AWS account. So this is not a user that you can find in AWS account. You can't just go to users and find the user there. No, it's a federated user, and this federated user comes from Cognito. And this user will be able to assume this role using this action. So STS assume role with web identity. And under conditions, we specify some additional information about this user. So who this user actually have to be. So it's not like this can be any user that belongs to Cognito. It has to be, first and foremost, it has to be user who has an identity in this specific identity pool. So the identity pool we created, and it has to be an authenticated user. So this only works for an authenticated user. And if those conditions are met, then this user can assume the role. And by assuming this role, it will get the following permissions. This is the default that you always have to specify for the whole Cognito to work. And this is our extra role that we specify, the poly role, so that we can transform text into speech. And in the end, we attach this role to this specific identity pool. And here we will just print some outputs to be able to easily configure the application. All right, so we are passing in here a lot of parameters, and those parameters are defined in this parameters -this JSON. We can actually copy it into parameters JSON like this, and we can edit everything in here. First, we want to specify our user pool name, my user pool name, the domain prefix that we want to use for the hosted domain, LinkedIn. We can leave this as is. We don't have to change or anything. The application client name then will be my client app. Identity provider, let's call it Auth0 since it's an Auth0. Auth0 client ID. Now we have to go back to the browser and to Auth0, to our application. And from here we can copy the client ID. And we also need the client secret. Client secret's also here. And we can paste it here. The issuer URL, that's HTTPS plus the domain from Auth0. That's the domain. And the identity pool name, my identity pool name. All right. Let's go back to the console and clean up the existing resources. since we already have here a few things, so we have our identity pool. So let's go to edit identity pool. And here at the bottom, we can delete the identity pool. All right. Now the user pool, here we have to start from deleting the domain itself. So first we need to delete the domain, and only then we can delete the pool itself. This should be, yeah, should be now deleted. There's one more thing we have to manually delete, and that's the rows that were created. This is actually not automatically deleted. We have to go to rows and search for Cognito, and here those two rows we can actually delete them. All right, so now we deleted all the resources from AWS. And now let's go here. In the README, you have the command that you can execute in your terminal to create the stack with all of the resources. Let's go to the terminal and create those resources. Now we can go back to the browser and we can go to CloudFormation. And we can see how the resources are being created. That shouldn't really take that long. If it takes too long, I'm gonna just cut it out of the video so you don't have to see it all, but it shouldn't really take long. Right, so all the resources are now created. And if we go back to Cognito, can easily check it. We have now our user pool with our custom attributes. We have the application client, the domain, and the settings. We already have all of the values. We have an OpenID Connect provider Auth0 with proper mappings. Now, if you remember, we previously configured something in Auth0 application. So we configured this domain, and we have to make sure that this is still the same domain as before. So let's go to our CloudFormation. And we can go to the Outputs tab. And here we have the callback for Auth0. We can simply copy it over and paste it here. I think it's exactly the same one as before, if I'm not mistaken. I think so. Yeah. All right. Now we have here a lot of additional data. Let's go to the Visual Studio Code, and we have to now edit our values here in the .env file. So let's just delete everything that we know could have changed. All of that stuff. And let's go back to the browser and copy it over. So first we need the user pool host. The user pool host that's here. This value. Now we need an app client ID. The application client ID is here. Now the sign out URL. This is the signout URL. You can paste that. User pool ID. The user pool ID. This is user pool ID. Okay. Identity pool name. Identity pool name. This is the identity pool name. And identity pool ID in the end. All right, let's just copy it over to Visual Code. And we have all of the settings. Let's start the application one more time. And now we can go back to the browser, to our front end. Let's just clear the cookies. So now we are logged out. We can actually do a tiny little cleanup here so that we can actually delete the user that we created previously, just to make sure that we are good here. We can remove the permissions for the application itself. So we are starting fresh now. All right. Let's see if it works. All right. So we have to specify, choose the provider, Auth0. Here we specify LinkedIn. Sign into LinkedIn. We give permissions to the application. And now we are back on our page and we can synthesize the text.
You successfully authenticated with LinkedIn using Auth0 and AWS Cognito.
And that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. You will also find links to all the resources in the video description. And if you prefer a written version, then there is also a blog post. You will find the link as well in the description. And that's it for today. See you next time.